No, I think I don't know, but you get your face like he slap on your face. Just wait the guy slap your face, and then you're gonna give back. It's too much for me.
In every division, there are fighters everyone wants to face. And then there are fighters no one seems to be calling out. Right now, Carlos Prates is starting to fall into that second category, not because of hype alone, not because of rankings, but because of the kind of problems he presents inside the cage. From a surface level view, his position might not immediately stand out. He isn't at the top of the rankings, and he hasn't been pushed as a mainstream name yet. But when analysts and fighters look closer, the conversation changes, because stylistically, Prates brings a combination that is difficult to prepare for. His striking is precise, measured, and built around timing rather than volume. He doesn't waste movement, and he doesn't rely on chaotic exchanges. Instead, he creates openings, and when those openings appear, he capitalizes quickly. From an analytical perspective, this creates a specific type of risk. Opponents aren't just dealing with power, and they're dealing with unpredictability and efficiency, and that combination affects decision making. In MMA, fighters don't just evaluate skill, they evaluate risk versus reward. Is the opponent dangerous? Is the matchup worth it? Does the fight move them forward? In the case of Carlos Prates, those questions don't always produce clear answers, which is why, despite his growing presence, he isn't being actively targeted by others in the division. And that raises a bigger question. Is this simply a matter of timing? Or is there a deeper reason why fighters are hesitant to engage? To understand that, it's important to look at who Carlos Prates is, and how he reached this position in the first place. To understand the attention around Carlos Prates, it's important to look at where his skill set comes from. Before gaining visibility in MMA, Prates built his foundation in striking, particularly in kickboxing. That background shaped the way he approaches fights, both technically and strategically. Unlike fighters who transition into striking later in their careers, his stand-up game is not an addition, that it's the core of his system. From a technical standpoint, his style is built around timing and control. He doesn't rely on constant pressure or high volume output. Instead, he focuses on reading his opponent, identifying patterns, and responding with precision. His strikes are often thrown with clear intent, rather than as part of a wider exchange. This creates a different kind of rhythm. Opponents aren't just reacting to attacks, they're trying to anticipate them, which introduces hesitation. And in striking exchanges, hesitation can be costly. Another factor is composure. Even in active exchanges, Prates tends to remain measured. He doesn't rush positions, and he rarely overextends. That level of control reduces unnecessary risk while still allowing him to capitalize on opportunities. From an analytical perspective, this combination of patience and accuracy can be difficult to deal with, especially for fighters who depend on pace or pressure. Because when one fighter is controlling tempo and the other is trying to force it, the dynamic becomes unbalanced. At this stage of his career, Prates is still building his position within the division, but the underlying elements of his style are already clear, and those elements, timing, precision, and composure, are part of what makes him a more complicated opponent than his record alone might suggest. When breaking down the style of Carlos Prates, the first thing that stands out isn't aggression, it's efficiency. He doesn't throw just to stay active, he throws with purpose. From a technical perspective, his striking is built around timing and shot selection. Rather than initiating constant exchanges, he allows moments to develop. He reads reactions, tracks movement patterns, and looks for openings that can be exploited with minimal risk. This creates a slower, more controlled pace. But that pace can be deceptive, because while the volume may appear lower, the impact of each strike carries more weight. His accuracy forces opponents to respect every exchange, which often reduces their willingness to engage freely. Another key element is distance management. Prates operates effectively at range. He maintains positioning, avoids unnecessary pressure, and uses spacing to control when exchanges happen. This forces opponents to either overextend or hesitate, both of which create opportunities. From an analytical standpoint, this is where his style becomes difficult. Fighters who rely on forward pressure may struggle to close distance cleanly. Fighters who prefer counter-striking may find fewer openings to work with. In both cases, the usual game plan becomes less reliable. There's also a compositional balance to his approach. He doesn't abandon structure for aggression. Even when he finds success, he maintains discipline rather than chasing finishes recklessly. That consistency limits defensive gaps. And in a sport where small mistakes often decide outcomes, reducing those gaps is a significant advantage. Overall, his style isn't built to overwhelm instantly. It's built to control, disrupt, and capitalize, and that combination creates a specific kind of challenge, one that isn't always easy to prepare for. At a technical level, many fighters are skilled, but what separates Carlos Prates isn't just skill, it's how that skill translates into risk for his opponents. From an analytical standpoint, danger in MMA isn't only about power, it's about unpredictability, timing, and the ability to create consequences from small openings, and that's where Prates becomes difficult. His striking doesn't rely on volume to be effective. Instead, it's built around precision, landing clean, efficient shots that carry impact without requiring extended exchanges. That reduces exposure. The less time a fighter spends in chaotic exchanges, the fewer chances there are for mistakes. At the same time, his composure adds another layer. He doesn't react emotionally under pressure. He maintains structure, keeps his positioning, and avoids overcommitting. That consistency makes it harder for opponents to force him into uncomfortable situations. Another factor is adaptability. Because he isn't locked into a single pace or pattern, he can adjust based on what the opponent presents. If the fight slows down, he controls distance. If it speeds up, he remains selective rather than reactive. From a matchup perspective, this creates a problem. Opponents can't rely on a single strategy. Pressure fighters may struggle to engage cleanly. Counter-strikers may find fewer opportunities. In both cases, the margin for error becomes smaller. And when the margin for error decreases, the perceived risk increases. This is where the conversation shifts, because fighters aren't just evaluating whether they can win, they're evaluating how likely it is and at what cost. And against a style like Prates, that calculation becomes more complicated than it initially appears. In MMA, matchups aren't decided by skill alone. They're shaped by risk, timing, and positioning within the division. And when it comes to Carlos Prates, those factors start to explain why he may not be an immediate target for other fighters. From a strategic standpoint, the first issue is risk versus reward. Prates presents a technically difficult style, precise striking, controlled pace, and limited openings. That makes him a challenging opponent to prepare for, especially without a clear path to exploit. At the same time, his current position in the rankings doesn't always offer a major upside. For higher ranked fighters, taking a high risk fight against someone still building their name may not significantly improve their standing. Even with a win, that imbalance affects decision making. Fighters at the top tend to prioritize matchups that either move them closer to a title shot or increase their visibility. If a fight doesn't clearly provide one of those outcomes, it becomes less attractive. Another factor is preparation. Styles like Prates' require a specific approach. His timing, distance management, and composure mean that standard game plans may not be effective. Adjusting for that takes time, and not every fighter is willing to make that investment without clear incentives. There's also the unpredictability factor. Because his style limits chaotic exchanges, opponents may struggle to impose their strengths. That uncertainty adds another layer of difficulty, not just in execution, but in planning. From an analytical perspective, these elements combine to create hesitation, not necessarily fear in a direct sense, but a calculated decision to avoid unnecessary risk. And in a sport where careers are shaped by a small number of fights, those decisions matter. As the discussion around Carlos Prates continues to grow, it's important to separate perception from measurable reality, because in MMA, narratives can develop quickly, especially when a fighter shows a unique or difficult style. From one perspective, the idea that opponents are avoiding him can be linked to the factors already discussed: risk, stylistic difficulty, and limited immediate reward. But from another perspective, it may also reflect timing. At this stage, Prates is still building his position within the division. He hasn't yet reached the level where top contenders are required to engage with him, and matchmaking decisions often prioritize rankings and title implications. This creates a natural gap. A fighter can be seen as dangerous without yet being central to the division structure. From an analytical standpoint, this is where perception can expand beyond available evidence. A few difficult matchups, combined with a strong stylistic identity, can lead to broader conclusions, including the idea that fighters are actively avoiding the matchup. But in reality, multiple variables influence those decisions: contract timing, injuries, short notice opportunities, and promotional priorities. All of these factors shape who fights who, often more than individual preference. That doesn't reduce the challenge Prates presents, but it does provide context, because while his style may create hesitation in specific scenarios, it doesn't necessarily define the entire division's approach to him. At this stage, both narratives exist at the same time: a fighter with a difficult style and a career still in progression, and understanding that balance is key to evaluating what comes next. At this stage, the conversation around Carlos Prates sits somewhere between projection and evidence. On one side, there's a clear stylistic profile, a fighter built around timing, precision, and control, capable of limiting exchanges and capitalizing on small openings. From a technical standpoint, that creates a level of difficulty that isn't always easy to prepare for. On the other side, there's positioning. Prates is still in the process of establishing himself within the division. He hasn't yet reached a point where top contenders are required to face him, and that affects how often his name comes up in potential matchups. From an analytical perspective, this is where interpretation becomes important. The idea that fighters are avoiding him can be understood as a reflection of calculated decision-making rather than direct fear. In a sport where each fight carries long-term consequences, risk is always evaluated against potential reward, and in his case, that balance isn't always clear. That doesn't diminish his potential. If anything, it highlights it, because fighters who create uncertainty, who disrupt standard game plans and reduce predictability, might tend to become more relevant over time. As his career progresses, that relevance will likely increase. More visibility, stronger opposition, and eventually fewer opportunities for others to bypass the matchup. At that point, the narrative will shift from speculation to confirmation, and when that happens, the question won't be whether fighters are avoiding Carlos Prates. It will be how they plan to deal with him inside the cage.